On a land where even the wind had forgotten to turn, an old man still cooked breakfast for two, though only he remained. A pregnant girl was dragged to market like livestock. She didn't cry, didn't plead. They never asked each other's names, never spoke of the past. There was only silence, and an unborn child, too young to understand the world, yet old enough to one day call out the name of a man the world had long forgotten. Part 1. Dry season. Dry heart rain hadn't come for 3 seasons. The earth cracked like a face long done crying. No one sowed anymore. The grass was sparse, singed beneath a silver sun, sharp as a thin knife. The cypress trees near the fence stood nearly bare, yet still standing, just like Boone Carter. He wasn't tall, wasn't young, but not old enough for a cane. His hair, dusty gray, hung just long enough to cover the back of his neck. His shirt was frayed at the shoulders, always buttoned to the top, even at noon. He rose before dawn every day, not out of duty, but because sleep too deep unnerved him. In a tiny kitchen with a single square window facing east, Boone boiled water in a cast-iron pot, black as inverted memory. The flame was low. He sat on a 3-legged stool with one chipped leg, waiting to cook oatmeal. The oats were tied with leather string in a neatly knotted bundle, kept in an old blue tin. The lid didn't seal anymore, but he never replaced it. 2 wooden bowls. One he filled and ate slowly, silently. The other he filled just the same, as if for someone with an appetite. He never looked at that bowl while eating. But once his own bowl was scraped clean, down to the last drop of milk, he cleared both, carefully, as if someone might scold him if the spoon was left crooked. Across from him, a folded cloth napkin lay untouched on the opposite chair. A faint ring, once made by a warm cup, still stained the wood, like a memory that refused to fade. Boone lived in a wooden cabin 5 miles out from town. No neighbors, no visitors. A worn saddle hung from the porch post, its straps rotted, yet always covered with cloth. Ready, as if it might be used again. He kept everything in a state of almost leaving, but never did. Inside the main room, a woman's beige dress still hung, its pleats untouched by dust. Boone wiped it weakly with a damp cloth. No photos, no altar, no written name. Just the dress and silence. On the porch, Boone polished an old bridle, not the one he used daily, but an aged set that once belonged to a horse long gone. He cleaned it as if his hands would forget how to hold things if they didn't touch it every day. Some afternoons the wind rose, carrying red dust from afar. Boone would sit there, eyes on the horizon, not waiting, not hoping, just out of habit, from a time when there was someone to wait for, and he never learned how to stop. Each time the wind slapped his face, Boone closed his eyes briefly. His palm clenched, then loosened, like grasping for a gesture that never had the chance to finish. In the barn there was only one old cow left. She gave no milk, bore no calves, but Boone fed her daily, laid fresh straw, and fixed the roof when storms came. She used to live with her, he once said to a passing mailman, the only person he'd spoken to in 3 months. On a small western windowpane, a fine crack traced across the glass like a hairline. Boone never patched it. Every sunset, light streamed through that crack, casting a golden thread across the floor, right into the corner where a blanket lay folded. He never stepped into that corner, but he changed the sheets every month. The house held no knocks, no laughter, no music, no scent of smoke, only the cautious steps of time and the hush of a man who'd lost everything, but still tried to keep something from unraveling. The 3rd dry season began with an unfamiliar ray of light, angled warmer than years past. Boone stood at the threshold, still holding the cloth he'd used to clean the saddle, and let the sunlight hit his eyes without blinking. It wasn't the light of rebirth, not a promise, just a flicker of warmth at the wrong time. enough to sting a man who'd lived with half a heart. He placed his hand on the bridle, but didn't keep wiping. He simply left his hand there, as if waiting for something that hadn't come in years. Part 2. The Horse Market and a Piece of Paper. It was a Thursday, horse market day on the dusty patch behind the old grain barn, barely 10 steps from the sheriff's office. No signs, just a red flag stuck to a cracked post, enough to tell folks today there'd be trading. The air buzzed, not with excitement but the grit of dry earth and hooves scraping gravel. Voices greeted each other in half-hearted phrases. Men arrived early, thin coats, hats pulled low, hands deep in leather pockets, too tired to spit, too wary to speak truth. Boone Carter didn't often come, but today he needed fresh rope and some salt blocks for the well. He tied his horse by an old elm. No lock, no worry. His horse wouldn't wander. It had learned to wait. Like him, that day's market felt no different, except for one ragged cloth sign that turned heads. Not for what it said, but how it said it. Letters scrawled in rough ink on burlap, strung to an old stall's beam with thorny twine. Can't keep her. Whoever wants, take. No full caps. No punctuation. Only take was pressed hard, as if the writer's nail had dug into the cloth. Beneath it sat a woman of about 40, cheeks flushed red, eyes blurred in cheap liquor. She squatted on the ground, bottle in hand, heel grinding into an old bridle. Beside her stood a pregnant girl. The girl didn't bow her head, nor raise it high. Her eyes stared straight ahead, but not at anything, like someone who'd seen too much to know where to look anymore. Her belly pressed against the faded cotton of her dress. By her feet sat a small bag, loosely tied with fraying cloth. A few men gathered. None stepped too close, but none walked away. They watched like men watching a lame horse being bartered. A carpenter snorted, "Well, damn, 8 months in and still holding shape." Another nudged his chin. "I'd trade 2 bottles and half a busted saddle." They laughed. The drunk woman didn't reply. She lifted the bottle, waiting for a nod. The girl didn't flinch. She simply clutched her belly like it was the last thing still intact inside her. Boone had been there for some time. No one noticed. No one ever did. Not men like him. Men who no longer reacted. He didn't rush in, didn't clear his throat, didn't push through the crowd. He walked through like slipping between thin trees, until he stood before the girl and her mother. He didn't look at the girl, didn't look at anyone. From his saddle he took a small leather pouch and laid it beside her worn cloth bag. From his shirt pocket he pulled out 2 dull silver coins, too old for trade, but heavy enough to silence a room. He placed them atop the salt pack. No words, no bargaining. The drunk woman cackled, downed the last swig, wiped her mouth. "Better than nothing. She's all belly now, light on price." Boone turned. Didn't wait for a response. The girl hadn't moved, but when her mother shoved her forward, she paused for a beat, like someone used to falling, still stepping forward on habit. No one spoke. When she came beside Boone, he didn't reach for her, didn't guide, didn't help. He simply walked ahead, for her to follow or not. She followed. Dust lifted lightly behind them. A wind slithered down from the hills, carrying burnt hay and wilted grass. The onlookers turned away. The crowd thinned, like nothing had ever happened. Only one set of footprints remained on the dry ground. Prints of someone not dragged away, but also not choosing to stay. Part 3. A house with no doors to close the road from town to Boone's place. Wasn't long, but the wind that day felt different. Not strong, just dry, thin, like the whisper of old fabric brushing past a wooden wall. The kind of wind that made silence between 2 riders feel less like absence, more like the remains of something long worn out. Boone rode ahead. His horse walked steady, unhurried. The girl followed behind on a small black packhorse, the kind Boone used to haul salt. Her belly tilted her slightly to the left. She gripped the saddle with weathered bare hands. No belongings. Nothing but the weight of an unborn child, and eyes that hadn't closed since they left the market. They crossed dry plains where grass reached no higher than the ankle. A wooden cross by the roadside still stood. The blood once staining the rock beneath it had long faded. Boone didn't glance that way. The wind carried the scent of burnt wood, horse sweat, and rusty iron from old horseshoe nails. The sun slipped behind the hills, casting two long shadows, one of a lone man, the other of a silent, round woman. The house appeared behind a line of dead willows, low gray, the roof slanting like a shoulder long burdened. The gate was open, no dog barked, no one waited. Boone dismounted, tied the reins with practiced hands, then turned, not touching, just nodding toward the porch. The girl stepped down slowly, her eyes scanning the cracked wood. She dismounted like someone waking from a long dream she wasn't ready to leave. The door wasn't locked. Boone pushed it open with his shoulder. It made no sound, as if it had opened often for those too tired to hear. He pointed toward a small room on the left. Clean bed. I don't go in. That was all. Then he walked to the back, where the barn and well stood. She stood there a while, didn't look around, didn't take off her shoes. She walked straight in, resting her hand on a white-painted wooden bed, its coarse linen folded too neatly, like it had never known sleep. One pillow, one low table, a copper basin turned upside down, and on the wall a hook still held a handkerchief. Washed, folded, not fragrant, but clean. She sat down, didn't sigh, didn't cry. She looked at her hands, calloused hands, still trembling when clenched. There were no sounds except the faint groans of old timber slowly giving in to time. As dusk settled, Boone returned. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He left nothing at the door, but there was the sound of warm water poured into a basin and the steady bubbling of soup from the stove. She didn't come out. He didn't call. Night fell like a heavy quilt on someone unwilling to sleep. Boone sat on the porch in the wobbly chair he always used. In his hands a small knife and a piece of wood, half carved, maybe a horse's head, maybe nothing. He coughed, dry, long, like dust that had lived too long in his chest. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried through the empty porch. She heard it from her room. She didn't get up. Boone sat there late into the night. No lamp lit. The cold wind returned, brushing tree branches gently against her window. No one shut the door. No one locked a thing, but no one stepped inside either. Part 4, a silence that didn't hurt. She woke the next morning to the sound of a bird pecking the eaves. Not singing, just a faint, steady tapping, like someone too timid to knock loud enough. Light slipped through the coarse curtain. Dust hung in the air like fine ash, brushing her lashes dry from a sleepless night. The room smelled of old wood, ashes, and something older, like clothes no one had worn in years. She stepped out without a sound. The blanket had been folded. Boone wasn't on the porch, but on the wooden counter near the stove. A pot of soup still steamed, fogging the sunbeams as if someone had just left minutes ago. Beside it, a hard loaf of bread wrapped in a folded cloth. No note, no instructions. Just a meal, clearly made for two. She stood there a long while, then gently unwrapped the bread. It wasn't fresh, but it had been wrapped like someone used to wrapping it for someone else, for years. Outside, Boone sat by the fence, his back to her. He carved at wood with his knife. At his feet, pale shavings scattered like dry snow. He didn't lift his head when she stepped out, didn't turn. She stood at the doorway, hesitant. A morning breeze blew dry straw from the porch. She bent to pick it up, not from manners, but because her hands needed something to keep from shaking. Above her, the roof creaked in the sunlight. A nail poked slightly from a rusted seam, like everything here had once broken, but refused to fall apart. As she stepped onto the porch, Boone didn't look. But his knife paused for a second, like his hands remembered what they were doing. She sat beside the doorframe, not close, not far. She didn't ask for a chair, just sat there, as someone might who once learned how to sit beside another without breaking the silence they lived in. After a while, she spoke, softly, not expecting a reply, just to keep her voice from disappearing. "Why haven't you asked anything?" Boone shrugged, didn't turn. "If it matters, folks'll say it." Then kept carving. His words weren't kind, weren't cold, just something he must have once told himself, years ago, when no one asked him anything anymore. The wind picked up again. An old broom fell over gently behind them, didn't break, didn't startle. She bent to set it back. The wind softened, like the house was used to quiet souls. At noon, when she stepped into the kitchen, the soup had been topped off with water, left simmering gently. Next to it, a second cup, clean, unused. Boone didn't come in, didn't ask if she was hungry, but that afternoon, out by the barn, he tied a second length of rope to the cow's trough, twice the usual length. Not because the cow needed it, but maybe so someone could learn to tie it, if they wanted. That night, his cough didn't echo. Not because he didn't cough, but because the window to her room had been pulled slightly closed. Just enough to keep the wind from howling, still enough to let the moonlight in. No one taught anyone anything. No one asked permission. No one forced a thing. Only one silence remained. But for the first time in her life, it didn't hurt. Part 5. The Dog with the Broken Leg. That afternoon, the air was still. No wind, no clouds, no birds. Just the kind of hush that felt like the land itself was holding its breath through a dry season that refused to break. Boone left the house earlier than usual, carrying a shovel, a coil of twine, and a small cloth bag tied tight. The girl saw him from the window. He didn't say where he was going. He never did. He just tossed a rag over his shoulder and vanished behind the low trees leading into the woods. She went back to the kitchen, stoked the fire, poured warm water into the wash basin. Jonah lay asleep in a wicker basket by the stove, his tiny hands curled beneath a thin blanket. It was nearly late afternoon when Boone returned. In his arms was a small dog, pale brown, fur matted with blood on its hind leg. The dog didn't bark, didn't resist. It only breathed hard, the breath of things too weak to cry from pain. Boone didn't look at her. He laid the dog gently near the hearth, then pulled from the cloth bag a thin piece of wood already shaped into a splint. He sat and worked like someone who'd done it many times before, steady, slow, yet every motion gentle, as if touching something too fragile to name. She stood by the door, watching, didn't ask. Boone felt along the dog's leg, found the break, then shifted the bone. The animal gave a soft whine, then went still. He wrapped the twine, firm but careful, then sliced the end clean with his pocket blade. The cloth beneath the leg was folded square. No blood showed. When he finished, Boone slid an old shirt beneath the dog, placing it close to the warm bricks of the fireplace. Only then did the girl step closer, eyes on the bandage. "It's hurt. Why didn't you let it go?" Boone didn't look up. He wiped the blade on his pant leg, stood, and pocketed the scraps of cloth. "Because it still trembles." Nothing more. She didn't ask again, but she walked to the kitchen, fetched a small metal bowl, filled it with warm water, and set it near the dog. Her hands were awkward, slow, like someone who had never done such a thing before, or who had never been told she could do something kind and not be punished for it. The dog didn't drink right away. It lifted its head, sniffed, then pressed its nose into the edge of Boone's old shirt. Boone had returned to the porch. The sound of wood carving resumed, steady like a clock that didn't mark time, just kept ticking. That night's meal was bean soup and a reheated piece of cornbread. No one invited anyone, but there were 3 bowls on the table, a smaller one placed on the floor by the leg. The dog drank it all. Later, the moon hung low, casting just enough light into the room to reveal the girl seated by the bed, combing out her hair. She moved slowly, not to loosen it, not to let it fall, just to feel it in her hands. Beneath her, the dogs curled up between her slippers, sleeping soundly. For the first time in weeks, she stayed long at the mirror, not to look at herself, but to grow used to the feeling of not being afraid, to be seen. And outside, by the leaning fence, Boone sat in stillness, his hands no longer carved, just held the block of wood, as if what needed shaping wasn't in the grain, but in something that had never been given a name. Part 6, a name no one called. It was a quiet morning, no wind, no clouds, nothing remarkable, which in that dry land was remarkable enough. True silence always felt like someone had just left or was about to. Boone didn't go outside early as he usually did. The girl noticed, not because he was gone, but because the bread was still on the table, yet the soup hadn't been reheated. The kettle was barely full. Something had slipped from the quiet rhythm they'd come to share. Jonah slept peacefully. The little dog, leg healing well, still curled near the crib. She washed the dishes, tidied the kitchen, then walked towards the main room, the one Boone rarely opened, though he never told her not to. The door was ajar. Inside, the room looked no different from the rest, plain, clean, but the air held something else, a scent older than wood, older than dust. The smell of time tucked away. On the desk lay a small leather-bound notebook, its cover nearly peeled away. No lock, no name. She opened it. The first page was written in faded ink, the handwriting sparse, the lines shaky, like something penned by lamplight or with a trembling hand. It read, "April, the gray cat got trampled by the dog. Buried under the peach tree, called it number 1. Second page, number 2, stillborn, left the basket by the stove even though there was nothing left to feed, and so it went. 7 pages, 7 lines, each marking a death. Cats, birds, rabbits, a small snake, but no names, just numbers, 4, 6, 7. The final page held only a single line, no number, no name. Hannah still hasn't forgiven, but I keep her dress folded straight. Below it, a streak of ink trailing off, as if the writer meant to go on, but either his hand had failed, or the words had. She closed the notebook, didn't read more, but instead of placing it back, she slid it between the old Bible and a worn gray hardcover, as if returning it to a place where it could finally be seen. Then she noticed, tucked in the corner under cloth, a guitar. Its strings were mostly broken, the wood darkened with age, but no dust. She gently pulled the cloth back, carefully, as if peeling away a memory that wasn't hers. She didn't know how to play, but her hand touched the guitar, not to strum, but to wipe it clean. And in that motion something shifted, like old dust exhaled from deep in her chest. At the doorway, Boone stood. No one knew how long. He didn't step in, didn't speak. He only saw the cloth she'd folded neatly left on the chair. And the guitar, silent, had already made the room echo with a sound no one could hear, but any soul who's ever been lonely would recognize. He turned away, said nothing. That evening, while she hung linens on the porch rail, Boone placed a slip of paper on the table. It was a handwritten list: milk, sugar, salt, and one line at the end, baby powder. No name signed, but for the first time at the very bottom in soft, slanted letters was written, Jonah, small, leaning, as if afraid someone might see. Part 7, Blood in the Wind. That night, the wind shifted, not loud, not urgent, but just enough to make the door creak twice, as if someone just beyond it was breathing. Closer than usual, Boone sat at the kitchen table stripping corn husks. into fine threads for tying bundles. The oil lamp burned low, its wick brown. The house was bathed in a light like the end of a dream, not bright, not dark, just enough to keep from slipping into nothing. The girl had gone to sleep. Jonah lay bundled near the stove, his breath light in the basket. The dog slept beside him, watching. Boone glanced their way now and then, but never rose. Outside, the wind shifted again. The porch roof let out a soft moan. Boone stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped out to check the ropes at the porch corner. As he returned, the moonlight slipped through the half-open door, casting a sheen on the floorboards. Something glistened, not water. He crouched. A small stain, dark red. Then a faint sound from the bedroom. Not louder than the wind through the gaps, but different, alive. Boone pushed open the door. She was curled tight, gripping the blanket, sweat pouring from her forehead. The mattress beneath her had soaked through. Not a flood, but it wouldn't stop. Her face was pale as cooled ash, eyes open but unfocused, lips parted. "Name him. You name him. I'm too tired." Boone didn't answer. He placed a hand on her brow, hot, wet, but still fighting, as if her body clung to something larger than itself. He lifted her. No towels, no preparation. His hands touched blood, warm, thick, but he didn't flinch. He carried her to the larger bed, the one no one had used in years. The green blanket still folded, still holding the faint scent of lavender from its last wash. Boone laid her down, opened the chest beside the bed, and pulled out a clean cloth. Every motion was slow, precise, not panic, just presence. In the corner, moonlight traced a crack in the headboard, like a wound that never sealed. She groaned. Her hand searched the air. Boone reached out, took it. "Jonah," he said, not a suggestion, a confirmation of what was about to enter the world, because he pulled me out of the belly of my own life. The words dropped into the room like a stone in a dry well. No echo, but the stillness rippled. Outside, the wind quieted, as if the land itself backed away to make room for either a death or a birth. Boone stayed the entire night, through blood, sweat, trembling breath. No midwife, no neighbors, just a man who had lost too much, choosing for the first time to stay. Her labor was not theatrical, no screaming, no dramatics, just short, hard sounds, like stone against stone until the breaking point. Then silence, and then a cry, small, thin, not yet a full wail, but enough to shatter the stillness that had settled over that room for years. Boone sank to his knees. His face was wet, whether from sweat or tears, even he couldn't tell. His hands trembled as he wrapped the child in a thin cloth, then placed him into her arms, her eyes still closed, breath ragged. She held the baby as if retrieving a part of herself, strange and familiar all at once. She said nothing, only reached out to touch his forehead, where the soft pulse throbbed beneath skin as thin as flower petals. Boone rose, didn't look back. He stepped outside. Dawn had begun to bleed into the sky. The first light touched the porch, revealing a footprint, still stained with blood. He didn't wipe it away. Part 8, light on a different face. That morning the mist clung to the ground. No clouds above, but the sunlight had to fight its way through layers of wind to kiss the roof of the old wooden house. Light pooled on the porch like forgotten chalk dust, broken open after years of being still. Inside, the girl woke. Her eyes were heavy, but her breathing came easy. Jonah lay against her chest, skin still red, hair damp and matted. He slept as though he'd just escaped from some far-off place and landed exactly where he was meant to be. She sat up slowly. Her body ached, but no longer felt scattered. For a moment she felt something odd, not peace, but an emptiness that didn't scare her anymore. The sheets had been changed. A jug of water and a slice of reheated bread sat on the chair nearby. Dry, not warm, but waiting. Boone was nowhere in sight. She stepped out onto the porch, steadying herself with the doorframe. The sun touched her eyes, gentle, not sharp, just enough to let her see the man standing by the tree line beneath the old willow. He wasn't working, wasn't holding anything. Hat tilted, arms loose. She wrapped Jonah carefully, shielding him from the breeze, and walked toward Boone. Each step beat clearer in her chest. Not fear, but that quiet curiosity that comes when fear is finally gone. Boone didn't turn, but as she neared, he stepped aside, just enough to reveal what stood before him. A low wooden marker, plain, covered in pale moss. No flowers, no ribbons, no ornate carvings, just a few rough letters, carved by hand. Hannah Carter. And the child never named. She didn't ask, didn't cry, but Jonah stirred in her arms, as if sensing the sorrow of a woman who never got to be a mother. Boone's eyes stayed fixed on the grave. He spoke without looking at her. She was born in July, only held him once. A soft breeze passed. Willow leaves brushed the earth with the sound of a held breath. The girl sat, placed Jonah gently on the grass. He slept on, his face turned toward the marker. She laid a hand on the wood and whispered, barely audible, "Now someone has a name in their place." No reply came, but Boone turned to face her for the first time since that day at the market. He didn't look at Jonah or at her blood-stained hands. He looked into her eyes. No fear there, no fight, just exhaustion and something else. Something like choosing to stay. Sunlight cut through the trees, falling across Boone's face. For the first time she saw the deep lines at the corners of his eyes. Not from age, but from years of holding back tears. "Cha!" She said nothing, didn't move closer, only lifted Jonah, turned, and walked towards the house, the one place where a door didn't need to be locked. Boone remained still, his hand tightening briefly on his hat. When he turned back, the light had shifted again, but his shadow fell longer than usual across the grass, like a man who had finally stood straight after years of bending beneath the weight of something unnamed. Part 9. Things left unsaid that afternoon. Golden light spilled evenly across the warped tin roof. A ray slipped through the cracked window pane, falling in a slanted line onto the wooden table, where, for the first time, there were 3 cups. One was old, chipped at the rim. One smaller, like something pulled from a long-forgotten wedding box. And one new. Not brand new, but one she had never seen placed there before. The girl stepped out of the room, her hair still damp from washing it, with mugwort boiled behind the barn. She held Jonah in her arms, the baby asleep, his hands curled inward like he was holding something precious. Boone sat at the table. He wasn't eating, wasn't reading, just sitting, as if relearning how to share space with someone without having to ask permission. When she laid Jonah into the basket by the stove and turned, Boone nudged the chair across from him a few inches outward, not far enough to be an invitation, but just enough to say, "You're not invisible." She noticed and sat without a word. They ate together for the first time, in silence. Only the soft clink of spoon against bowl, and Jonah's small whimper as he turned in his sleep. After the meal, Boone stood, pulled a small knife and palm-sized block of wood from his pocket, and stepped out to the porch. He settled into the wobbly chair, whittling, as he always did. She didn't go inside. She sat on the steps, unwrapped the towel from her hair, gently combed Jonah's wisps of hair, then her own. The wind was soft. The light dipped from gold to amber, then slid toward honey. She spoke, not turning toward him. "Do you ever think you were wrong?" Boone carved a deep line into the wood. Slow, then answered, still looking down, hands steady. "I think I survived." "That's wrong enough." A moment later, he stopped carving, set the knife on his knee. The shape in the wood was still unclear, but the lines weren't harsh. They felt like someone trying to remember the shape of something once familiar, but long unlabeled. The girl rose, lifted Jonah, walked to the door. Before she closed it, she looked back once, not to thank him, not to speak, just to remember that there was someone still sitting there, shoulders a bit stooped, hands not yet finished. That night, under the soft breath of the oil lamp, Boone entered the kitchen. He took a napkin, folded it into fourths, placed it neatly on the chair across from his. No one saw, no one praised. But the next morning, the napkin had been washed and folded back the same. Part 10. Days that didn't need permission. After that day, Boone no longer saw her waiting for him to leave before stepping outside. Each morning, as he pulled on his old sweater and stepped onto the porch, she was already there. Milking the one old cow, Jonah slept in a wicker basket nestled in straw nearby. Boone said nothing, didn't move faster, but once as he passed, he let out a sentence so soft it barely stirred the morning air. That one kicks sometimes. Tie her back leg. She nodded, didn't answer. But the next morning the rope was tied just right. The days that followed had no plans, yet things got fixed. They started patching the porch roof, one plank at a time. Boone sawed. She held. He climbed. She steadied the ladder. Hours could pass without a word, but every gesture was exact, as if each had quietly learned what the other needed. At noon, she spread a cloth on the porch floor. Lunch was simple, bean soup and cornbread. 3 portions. Jonah slept beneath the tree, his knitted cap slipping from his brow. That day, Boone looked at the child, really looked. He didn't bend down, just stood there, hands on the shovel, sunlight brushing past his shoulder. The wind stirred Jonah's fine hair, reminding Boone of something he'd once touched and never let himself hold. As evening fell, they lit the lamp early. Boone sat on the porch, threading a frayed shirt sleeve with quiet care. Inside, she held an old Bible. Read aloud, gently, not preaching, not declaring, just reading like someone who'd once listened to another's voice and was trying now to remember how it sounded. Boone didn't nod, didn't object. He just sat there, in the posture of a man who had lost too much to believe that anything that stayed would stay for good. Night deepened. Jonah fussed, then fell back asleep. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, not wild, not loud, just warm, like 2 people, once burned by too much, had finally begun to learn how to heat a home without scorching it. Part 11. The seed keeper that evening, after dinner, Boone didn't return inside like usual. Instead, he walked out toward the old fence, its posts gray with age, a few tilted from storms that came and left without asking. In his hand was a small bucket. Inside, a few shriveled persimmon roots, misshapen, wrinkled, not the kind anyone expected to grow again. The girl followed, carrying Jonah. She didn't ask, just stood at a quiet distance watching. Boone crouched at a patch of earth, using a hand shovel to dig small, even holes, each one a hand's width apart. His movements were slow, not from age, but like a man careful not to disturb the soil too deeply, as if something sacred lay underneath. With each hole, he placed one root inside, pressed the dirt over gently, and tapped it down with the heel of his boot. No rush, no expectation. Just doing. The girl stepped closer, Jonah asleep against her chest, wrapped in a soft cloth. They stood beside each other, no touching. After a moment she spoke. Not to him exactly, but like saying something aloud she needed to hear herself. They won't sprout. Boone didn't look up. His voice came quiet, as if the wind had already heard it once before. I know. but she used to smile whenever they leafed, even when they never bloomed. His words fell to the ground like the last ash from a long dead fire. No one asked who she was. No one needed to. The girl was quiet for a while. Then she laid Jonah down on a blanket beside a tree stump, picked up the second shovel without being offered, and began to dig beside him. The soil here was dry, but not dead. Beneath the dust there was still softness, as if spring had never truly left, just gone into a long sleep. They kept digging, small hollows side by side, planting not for harvest, but to bury something unnamed, something that needed to be kept close. By the time Jonah stirred awake, the western sky had turned the color of ripe wine. She brushed the dirt from her hands and sat beside her child. Boone stood nearby, his shadow long across the blanket, like the canopy of a tree that hadn't borne leaves in years. No one said they'd started again. No one spoke of seasons, just the quiet knowledge that once someone had planted something that never bloomed, and still smiled. Part 12. The child who spoke a name that morning. Boone was on the porch, mending the elbow of a worn shirt. He used thick thread, each stitch like a step across an old memory. No two mended spots looked alike, because no wound had ever broken in the same way twice. The wind carried the scent of damp grass, not sweet, not sharp, just familiar enough to go unnoticed, unless you'd once missed it for a very long time. From inside the house, the sound of tiny feet across wooden floorboards. Jonah. He didn't run to the yard, didn't call for his mother. He just stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around a small wooden chicken Boone had carved weeks ago. The child chirped something, unclear, soft, but loud enough to reach. Boo, not Dad, not Grandpa, just boo, like a heartbeat whispered into the world by someone realizing they weren't alone. Boone froze mid-stitch. He said nothing, just rested his hand on the fabric, eyes fixed on the rising sun. The girl came out moments later, dark rings still under her eyes. She bent down, picked Jonah up, and smiled faintly. "Who does he think you are?" Boone didn't answer, didn't need to. But from that day on, he washed his face more thoroughly in the mornings, and before heading to the field, he stood in front of the cracked mirror by the door and shaved, not to look better, but to recognize the face that a child had chosen to give a name no one taught him, yet somehow he already knew. Part 13. The Letter with No Name. That afternoon, Boone returned from town, quieter than usual. In his hand was a letter, dusted with road dirt, faintly smelling of cheap whiskey, its handwriting jagged like someone who no longer remembered what they meant to say. He said nothing as he entered the house, hung his old hat on the hook, pulled off the boots with a small tear in the heel, a wound from last winter when he'd slipped near the creek and told no one. There was no wind that day, but the smoke from the chimney kept rising like a house slowly exhaling what words couldn't. Boone sat down, opened the letter, read it slow, word by word, as if he didn't want to understand it too fast. "I don't know how your wife died, but I was wrong. I said something I shouldn't have. I hope you've found some kind of peace." He folded the paper. Didn't read the rest. Outside, Jonah was playing with the lame dog, the one Boone had once splinted. It walked now, though still tilted a little when it ran. The girl was hanging laundry, smoothing each sleeve like she was ironing the years inside her. Boone walked to the back, carried the letter with him. He didn't burn it in the stove, didn't bury it in the mud. He slid it between two pieces of dry wood, lit the fire, and sat beside it until the paper was gone, to ash. No curses, no anger, just letting the wind take what no longer needed keeping. That night, for the first time in years, Boone laid his hand gently on someone's shoulder. Not firm, not asking for anything, just like wind brushing a tall blade of grass. Brief, software, but unforgettable. He spoke, voice rough and low, not looking at her. "Thank you for not asking." She nodded, no words. But after that night, the way they looked at each other changed. Not closer, not further, just steadier, like two survivors watching a field after the fire, and somehow knowing that somewhere beneath the soot, the grain would return. Part 14. Even flowers that never bloom are still flowers. That evening, the sunlight slanted across the porch, so golden it felt like someone had stirred honey into the sky. A breeze moved through the field, not cold, not warm, just enough to make even silence seem alive again. Jonah ran through the light, barefoot, dusty, clutching a bundle of wild dog grass, still wet with morning dew. He shouted, "Mama, boo!" His voice was clear and bright, ringing across the roof, over the fence, straight into a heart that once believed it had dried and cracked beyond repair. The girl sat on the porch step, one hand bracing her back, the other outstretched to catch the wild bouquet. A thing no one planted, yet bloomed all the same. Beside her, Boone was fixing the screen door, eyes still sharp, hands slower now. He looked at the boy, then at her. The light touched their cheeks, like an answer to a question no one had dared ask. Later, when Jonah napped on an old mat, breath steady like wind passing through young wheat, Boone spoke without turning. "I used to think I was dry land." She rested her hand on the curve of her belly, round again. Didn't speak right away. Then, soft. "Sometimes a seed has to fall on dry land to grow strong enough to rise." They said nothing more, didn't have to, just sat. An old man, a young mother, a child, like three stars that didn't need a sky to find each other. Far off, where Boone had once buried the rotting persimmons she said would never bloom, a single green sprout pushed through the earth, small as a baby's nail, straight as morning. It needed no welcome, no reason, only that it was time to live. And so the story stops, neither closed nor open, like an old wooden door that still clicks gently in the wind. Some seeds never bloom into flowers, but sometimes just planting them is enough to make someone stay. Boone never needed to be called father. The girl didn't need to know who he used to be. And the child only needed someone to be there when he spoke his first word. This story doesn't end in a miracle. It ends in a golden afternoon, with a child running through sunlight and a man who once wanted to disappear, smiling again. If you've ever survived days when you thought you'd lost everything, if you've ever chosen silence instead of blame, then tell me in the comments below about someone who didn't leave, about a touch that asked for nothing, or simply about one small thing that made you pause.